and welcome to Riverfront Park's third presentation of Ghost Stories in the Park in its beautiful refurbished indoor and outdoor theater. So we're all warm and we're away from the rain. That's wonderful. This was our United States government's pavilion during the Great Expo of 1974. And we have tonight and also one additional night, next Friday from 7 to 8:30, we'll have other ghost stories for our final October presentation here in the park. I'm your host, storyteller, raconteur, and resident weirdo in Spokane, Chet Caskey. To my right is KPBX's public radio storyteller, the lovely and improper tonight, Mary Walker. To the left, we have the very attractive and pious Barbara Ernst. I originally met Barbara in a cemetery in Ontario, California. She was wandering around. She's like that. I had a legitimate excuse. I was meeting my druggist there for legitimate reasons, but Barbara was just wandering. No, that's a joke.
You got to talk into the microphone.
All right, fine. We have tonight representatives of, as usual, East Washington Paranormals Group, and they're going to give us their latest findings and show us some equipment. Jill Reeves, as we've already established, the supervisor of Spokane Parks and Recs Department, is not here tonight. Boo. At my right, I think at my right, over there, dressed as a widow to my chagrin, is my life partner, Kathy Caskey. She's jumping the gun just a little bit tonight. So without further ado, let's extinguish the ghost lights for the next hour and a half and ask that the ghost presence in this place go out for a breath of fresh air. And we will commence. You know, tonight one of our themes is fire, ladies and gentlemen. The ghost of fire has haunted our city since its foundation and continues to haunt us into present times. Fire is a dark part of the history of many of our cities in the United States. A substantial part of New York City burned in 1776, 1835, 1845, and of course 2001 as well. New Orleans, my home city, burned in 1788 and in 1794. In 1805, the city of Detroit burned to the ground. Our good friends and cousins, the British, burned Washington, D.C. in 1814. In 1849, most of St. Louis was destroyed by fire, along with many, many steamboats that were in the wharfs along the Mississippi River. During the Civil War, Atlanta, Georgia, Richmond, Virginia, Columbia, South Carolina, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana were all burned to the ground. Chicago was burned by fire in 1871. In 1889, Seattle and Ellensburg in our own state of Washington were largely destroyed by fire. Following the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, fires broke out and burned 80% of the city. Our own city of Spokane, and actually the island upon which we're now situated, Havermill Island, has had devastating fires with many spiritual consequences over the years. The Front Street Fire in Spokane of January 19, 1883 destroyed a substantial part of downtown Spokane as it burned along what is today Spokane Falls Boulevard and then turned south to destroy much of the downtown area. On May 15, 1890, another tragic fire broke out in a three-story rooming house and saloon on Howard Street, right across the street here, 6 blocks from where we sit on the corner of 2nd Avenue. This fire spread rapidly to both sides of Howard Street And onto adjacent blocks, many downtown buildings were destroyed, including the Methodist Tabernacle, a large building. Several people, including an infant, lost their lives in that fire. In 1892, a fire at this very place where we sit tonight, Havermill Island, destroyed 6 commercial buildings and 2 homes on a street that used to run right here along where we sit, resulting in the deaths of 4 people. No one of the park rangers in our area, I don't know if we have a few of them around a few minutes ago, say that our very pavilion right here and the outdoor part to our rear is haunted, at least according to them. They have experienced paranormal events, and police aren't usually the type to make up things like that. From October 6 through October 22, 1991, prairie lightning strikes and a 62-mile-an-hour wind here in Spokane created the Great Firestorm of Spokane. Do any of you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
91.
Yeah, 1991. Well, some people here weren't alive then. But the firestorm outside the city surrounded the city on 3 sides and threatened to completely destroy the city. It was desperately put out by firemen from 4 states. 114 buildings were burned to the ground, and 2 people lost their lives. 114 buildings destroyed, and 2 of our neighbors burned to death in the Spokane firestorm 28 years ago, this very month. A fire that occurred on January 24, 1898 in downtown Spokane that we could hit with a pellet gun just right over here is of special interest to us. If you're interested in ghosts, and if you aren't, why are you here? What did they call this fire, Mary?
They called it the Great Eastern Block Fire.
Are you going to tell us about it, Mary?
Yes, I am. Oh, you mean like right now?
Yeah, like on page 6. Are you going to tell us about it, Mary?
Oh. This was the Great Eastern Block Fire at 10 North Post. Did I say haunted? Yes, haunted, and specifically haunted by fire. Buildings located on that spot have burned 6 times since 1889. A fire broke out in the building in April in 1916, destroying the street-level shops. In June of 1956, a 3-alarm fire broke out that sent 17 firefighters to the hospital and required 25 others to be treated for smoke inhalation. Fire Captain Leonard Doyle was leading a hose crew into the burning building when the first floor collapsed and he plunged down into the basement along with burning flooring and debris. He was trapped but was standing in okay. As he shouted instructions to his crew to bring a ladder, the floor gave way and 2 stories above, and a large heavy safe came crashing down and through the stories and crushed him to death. Yeah. As weird as Fire Captain Doyle's death was, the fireman who was hired to take his place, Captain Leroy Mackey, was killed in a fire just down the street 10 years later at the Sod's Shoe Store fire in January of 1966. There were also fires in the Peyton Building in November of 1976 and in August of 1979. Yes, I'd say haunted by fire. And then there was the Great Eastern Block Fire. This fire occurred at the haunted Peyton Building in January of 1898. I believe I can speculate that many of the ghost stories associated with this spiritually troubled building today date from the Great Eastern Fire. There were enough bizarre and tragic deaths in that event to fill the building with ghosts. The huge Eastern Bloc building at the southeast corner of Post Street and Riverside was built in 1890 for the Eastern Hardware Company and was one of the largest buildings in Spokane at the time. It nearly took up the entire block. Retail stores occupied the street level. The next 2 floors were dedicated to law and business offices, and the top 2 floors were apartments where 150 people lived. Mimi Davenport and her daughter, the mother and sister of eventual hotelier Louis Davenport, were renters there. The family of the wild and restless Kathleen Eloise Klondike Kate Rockwell lived there. But by 1896, Klondike Kate was an erotic dancer in the goldfields of Canada and had been christened Queen of the Yukon by her male admirers, but I digress. Then, on the night of January 24, 1898, at about 11:45, when most of the building's residents were sleeping, a fire broke out that would eventually burn the great structure to the ground in an intense firestorm that sent flames several hundred feet into the sky and took the lives of at least 9 people, and possibly 2 others. The other deaths in the Great Eastern Fire were tragic to be sure, but substantially less honorable. Rose Smith was a 21-year-old young woman who worked in a millinery shop. She lived on the 4th floor of the Great Eastern apartment with her mother and her little 5-year-old sister Maud. The 2 girls, Rose and Maud, perished in the flames, while their mother, Mrs. Smith, had simply run from the apartment and down the stairs to save herself, leaving her girls behind to die. That's an unusual story. In fact, that's a very unusual story, but this was the Great Eastern.